Okay, hello everybody watching this later. We've got some wonderful people here. We're going to have an open-ended conversation about various aspects of writing. We've got two wonderful people from the Philippines who can introduce themselves as they go through, who are experienced people in this writing area. Of course, myself, you've probably seen enough of me, and Susan. Susan, whereabouts are you, Susan?
I'm in Leash in the middle of Ireland.
In the middle of Ireland, and Anne-Marie, who's also in Ireland as well. So most of the people watching this will be later, either through our festival or festival website, or also on our Substack. So thank you for coming and joining us. And I was just asking Robin about some of the stories from the Philippines and how they might be different culturally, and how the placebo effect might impact our choices on what is good writing, the classics of English that we're supposed to believe are good. And so there's various threads to that. And Robin was just telling us, and please go ahead telling us about the that story, Robin.
Okay. So I'm gonna give two examples. So one is the Noli Me Tangere. In English, the title translates as "Touch Me Not." Okay. So it basically the title kind of says it all. You don't want to make because the title "Touch Me Not, Noli Me Tangere" it's based on a certain type of cancer that you wouldn't want to touch because it's gonna get worse if you touch it, and it's gonna be very, very painful. So the characters basically in that novel, they're pretty passive. They can't do anything. Um, they just have to take in whatever the world has to offer them. And it is good, even when it's dominated by passive characters, characters that are helpless. And then the other one is a movie. It's a Filipino movie. The title translates as 3 Years Without God. It's a World War II movie in the Philippines when we were taken over by Japan. And again, the characters are pretty passive. I mean, what can you do really um if you're under a mighty empire and basically all your movements are restricted. So basically, these are I think movies that are well appreciated here, with even with very passive characters as opposed to very active ones.
So we have traditions in Ireland of quite passive characters as well, where there's many stories about the ordinary lives of people. And some stories, they contain just a single day, or they talk about what happens in a life. It doesn't have to be a huge adventure for things to happen. And we've also got another type of literature, misery literature, which is about the terrible, terrible things that happen in the farm, or because the people were alcoholics. And there's a lot of that. And there's a stereotype thing that sometimes happens about Irish stories, misery literature, or sometimes those very single. And there's been criticism of, for instance, Irish crime fiction was criticized as being quite lightweight because it doesn't criticize society. It just tells the stories of bad apples. So those are some of the things that have happened with Irish literature. So please tell us more about any reaction to that.
Uh, yeah, a little over 10 years ago, I was doing a study on crime fiction. I had to study three crime fiction novels coming from the Philippines. And in preparation for that study, I was studying the timeline of crime fiction, going all the way back from the Penny Dreadfuls, and then look just to compare it with the kind of crime fiction we do in the Philippines. And one thing I discovered was that in the Philippines, we like to tell the stories of the victims of the crime. In most crime fiction, we tend to focus either on the criminal uh, or the detective. But for some reason, we tend to follow the story of the victim. You know, how sometimes they lead normal lives and then it climaxes upon the tragedy. And I just found it very fascinating that was the interest.
Were those novels successful, those in terms of readers?
Yes, yes. Surprisingly so. I mean, for me, it was like, wow, it's breaking all I know about crime fiction, and yet um, the novels won awards. The critics liked it, and when I read it, I had to admit, uh, it's not what I'm used to, but there is merit to following the lives of the victims. Yeah.
Interesting. So we've drawn some cultural differences, and I don't think we can judge which is there is no better. It's just different. We are different, and I think that's important. And I think it's important for our own stories that we can look at another way of thinking, particularly to make our stories more interesting as we do that and more reflective. One of the things that's developing here, another thing that's developing, which I'm thinking of doing, is this idea of shadow work, which is about hidden motivations for our writing. So the young in ideas that we are motivated by things deep inside our subconscious. So that's starting to come into writing. Joanna Penn has written a very good guide to using the shadow work in your writing. And one of the things that I think about when I write the same story over and over, but with different characters, okay, and I find myself writing the same thing, an adventure. I'm trying to break free from that, okay? And so this is might be a tool for that sort of shadow work, thinking about our subconscious, what motivates us to write this way. Of course, Campbell had the hero with 1,000 faces idea that all the story of all our stories are similar. So, have you any thoughts about any of that subconscious and Campbell's work? Putting you on
I
this,
think,
Robin.
yeah, I mean, well, I'm gonna say it applies to everything we do, really, not just in writing. Um, there's always a reason we're unaware of, I think. With writing, however, I think gets more pronounced, or that's probably a good time for us to catch that because it's a very personal work. So if we really want to understand ourselves deeply, more deeply, I think, yeah, writing is one of the things we can do. Because sometimes I get uh I get caught off guard by my own writing. Like seriously, I'm writing things like this. Um, and when some of my readers tell me things they noticed, which yeah, some of them would just surprise me as well. Like, really, I wrote that. I didn't notice that. How could I have written something like that? So yeah.
What are you writing, Robin? What are you writing now?
Um, I'm writing historical fiction mainly, which is yeah, I think that's also quite revelatory of who I am as a writer because originally, at least when I was starting with prose and when I was starting with novels, I only wrote fantasy. But when I started reading history, I thought, like, why am I wasting my time trying to build worlds when in fact the historical realities of our world, of my country are complex enough to give me stories and they're quite magical as well. I mean, not literally, but um so what does that say about me as a writer? You know? Um,
Yes, I saw
so
your yeah, I saw
yeah.
your book. Very interesting. And this is the thing about what publishers get to choose, and what stories we see over here in Ireland often reflects what English and American publishers choose as the right books. So, okay, let's move on to a different phase. Joan, did you have anything you wanted to talk about? We had some particular subject areas after my baffling interjections. Is there was there something you wanted to, because I know you had a couple of subject areas you wanted to talk about. Is there anything you'd like to come in and talk about on the agenda for today?
Oh yes. For me, uh, because I've been really on a quest with regard to that bane of all writers, which is writer's block. Over the years, eventually I started discovering that, writer's block isn't really the problem. It's writer's block is like a fever that it tells us that we have a problem. So it's a good sign. If you cannot write, you have to find out the reason why we cannot write. And once we are able to identify why we cannot write, then the writer's block is breakable. And um, Robin and I have been talking about it for a bit already as well. And at least from my end, I've identified 5 general categories for writer's block. And for the most part, I think the moment I identified those and I've come up with my own solutions, I realized I
What,
don't really suffer writer's block ever since.
what are those 5 areas?
The first area is the problem of I don't know what to write. And then the second one is I don't know how to start. The third one is I can't find time to write. Um, the fourth one related to the first one is um, if I do find time to write, I'm already so super tired. And then the last one is everything I seem to write sucks. I can't get it right. Um, so generally, those are the 5 categories, and yeah, so it's about being. I would call the first one being unprepared, being overwhelmed. Um, yeah, the other one, of course, is tiredness. Uh, Having a very being very busy, and then the other one is something we would call either the fear or the ego. Yeah.
Do you have students facing those problems? Do you have students who face those problems?
All the time, all the time. And that's part of the reason why I've been giving workshops for over 10 years now. Um, and that's one of the things that I first bring out. I specialize in dealing with the writer's block. So usually when people come in, and that's how over time I was able to categorize them into those 5 things.
Okay. So tell me, I have a problem. I don't have enough time to write now. Okay.
Oh,
So
oh,
can you help me? Okay.
definitely. Usually, what I've discovered is when people say that they don't have enough time, they are looking for chunks of 30 minutes, 45 minutes, 1 hour. And usually, even at my at this stage of my life, that's a luxury, finding those 30 minutes. But um, what if we try to optimize those little bits of 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes within the day? Because if you think of it in terms of a week, those little 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, they become uh they will really be more than 4 hours. And
Yes.
definitely that's something worthwhile. And even if you were to progress just one sentence in those 2 minutes, that's still one sentence closer to the goal. Yeah.
Yes. I have a thing that I go to a writers' meetup on Wednesday at 6:30 in the evening, and we write for 45 minutes. Now, I have to write for 45 minutes because I'm in a coffee shop with 8 or 10 other writers, and everybody goes quiet, and we listen to the music and we write, and it's beautiful. If I was at home, okay, at 6:30 on a Wednesday afternoon, I couldn't write. I would not be, it's not possible. So this is psychological, right? There's something
Uh,
psychological. If you're with a group of writers and I have to get the tram into town, and so it takes a lot of time. So I get 45 minutes writing, and it takes maybe 3 hours, the whole thing. It's interesting. But if I stayed at home, I couldn't do 45 minutes of writing. I would find something else. I would read a book or watch
Yeah.
something stupid on YouTube. I don't know. Does anybody else face writer's block? Susan or Anne-Marie, come in and talk to me. Talk to us.
Hi, Lawrence. This is really interesting. I'm really enjoying the content this morning. It's fantastic because as a new writer, um, I am sort of the opposite at the moment, and because I have just tried to publish my debut novel, um, I had to pull myself away from writing. So I too have written historical fiction. It's a passion of mine. It's something I've always enjoyed being involved with. And for me, it's just absorbing myself into those worlds. But I found in writing my novel, I had to tear myself away from actually writing because I became so involved with my characters and with the topics that I was writing about that I hours would pass. And I've read about a lot of writers who say that, and a knock might come to the door, something might disturb me, and I feel like I'm being sucked out of where I was. So I haven't experienced writer's block yet. What I am worried about is, so I gave a very specific period to write this book, and I had very little distractions. What I am concerned about is I'm going to be moving back into real world life in the next number of months. I'm now working on my second novel, and I know I will not have the luxury of all that time. So I'm going to have to be very specific with those minutes, those, 25 minutes, those half-hour sessions. I'm going to have to be very structured. So it's really interesting to listen to this topic today because I'm going to have to structure myself better.
That's good.
Mm,
So, yeah, thank you. And thank you for being here and for contributing. That's really interesting. I know that thing about getting lost and not wanting to be distracted,
mm.
where you want to put a lock on the door to make sure nobody comes in, only if it's a fire. Okay.
Case of emergency.
It's a severe emergency,
Yeah.
needing a proper lock on the door. Uh,
I did read a great, I think it was Stephen King's book on writing, and it was one of the first books I read. I personally found it really helpful. And, a lot of successful authors will say, just turn up. Colin Tobin is the same. One of the best pieces of advice I ever saw that he wrote was just turn up at the page and it will come. And that has really helped me by just turning up, sitting there it will come. And personally, that has worked for me. Sometimes, if you're just having a block, you're stuck, you don't know what you're going to do. When you sit down to write, it does come. So I think turning up was really, really important. And both Colin Tobin and Stephen King both have said that.
Very good. Very useful. Thank you very much for that. I'm going to bring
Mm.
Susan in. Susan, please give us your reaction to any of this.
I think the advice that Joanne, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, was saying about maximizing the small amount of time. I think that's very good. It's
Mm.
difficult to do for writing, but I think it's very it kind of stops you being a bit precious about it and thinking, oh, I can only write if I have a big block of time or if the muse moves me. It makes it more a practice. I will sometimes get, mm, I think writer's block in terms of the fifth form, which is kind of disillusion. I mean, looking at something thinking, this is rubbish. This is rubbish. So what I tend to do is go and do something completely different. So I'll go and do gardening or I'll go and do something that's very different and allow it to just untangle itself. And the other thing that I do that I find useful is some form of free writing. So if I'm really stuck or I have half an hour and it's not long enough a period of time to do something that I really need to do, I'll just start writing. And even if it has nothing to do with what I'm working on, it might be the core of a short story later, it might just be a bit of flash fiction. Just start writing and keep the pen moving and don't let yourself stop. And the last thing, just to pick up on what you were saying, Lawrence, about writing in a group. I'm not a great person for group activities, but I did join they call them the writers' sprints. So it's a group and we meet and we write for 20 minutes, there's a very short break, we write for another 20 minutes, very short break, and it has exactly the effect that you were saying, Lawrence, where you mightn't have done it if you were on your own. You've shown up, and it's kind of like a positive peer pressure, because people are expecting you to do this in good faith, and then they're not expecting you to kind of, skive off and, go make cups of tea. There is a kind of a positive pressure on you to actually get something done. And it may not be great. It may not be great, but it's words on the page, and it's 2 pages more than you had when you started. So, yeah, um, I think just going for it a lot of times, even if the end result was not exactly a contribution to the work that you're focused on, but it keeps you in frame of mind where that's what you do. You write. You're a writer. That's kind of how you approach the world. So it's kind of constantly something that you're working at. So, yeah, thanks very much for this. It's been very interesting.
Thank you, Susan. That's very good, very interesting. You're absolutely right. The group thing, very important. So I was interested, John, in this QT3K thing that you had as one of the tools, okay, for writer's block. Can you explain that for us, please?
Okay. The QT3K is means question, time, and three keywords. And there's a whole science to it, because what happens to us when we look at a question, our minds automatically look for an answer. And so sometimes, even if we were to have an outline, sometimes we feel the writer's block, right? But if we were to phrase one bullet point into the form of a question, I mean, that's one way to go about it, then our minds become a lot more active. Now, or um, three general questions that I would usually ask is, what do I want my readers to know? What do they already know? What do they need to know first? And that already gets my mind running. Now, the three keywords, it helps me to prevent choice paralysis, because we know millions of words, right? But if I choose, but if I prepare three keywords to help me answer each question, I'm really just focusing on those three. My choices are quite limited, and it becomes a lot easier to start. And besides, just having three keywords also um, allows us to come up with paragraphs. Because any three words we can form into a paragraph. And then of course the time limit is so that we could always move on to the next bullet point. That's the whole idea. Of course, I mean there's a lot more to it, but I think the super basics of the QT3K are those. I mean, I can talk for hours with regard to the QT3K, but it's a very simple system. So that's why if I only have 10 minutes, it only takes me less than 10 seconds to look at my question and my three keywords, and then I'm ready to start writing.
So if I have 10 minutes to do something and it's a Tuesday night at 6:30, okay, and my group is on Wednesday, but I want to do some writing on Tuesday night. What should I do at 6:30? What should I do? Ask myself a question about the work. How will I do it in practical terms?
Yeah, well, in practical terms, assuming you have already an outline, you
Yes.
choose one bullet point that you want to write. And sometimes, if you don't really have any particular question in mind, is to really just write, what do I want my readers to know about this event? What do um, what do they need to know first, right? What do they already know? I mean, you don't have to answer them in any particular order, but being able to write those questions are sufficient. And then for each question, you write three keywords, and usually those three keywords will come from your bullet point. Um, and then the writing will flow. Give yourself, depending on how important the question is to you, sometimes you need 10 minutes to answer one question. Sometimes you can push yourself to just spend 3 minutes. It takes 2 minutes to get into the zone. That's what I've learned.
2 minutes.
Yeah, 2 minutes. They call it the 2 minutes of commitment. If you don't feel like it, you tell yourself, I'm just going to write for 2 minutes. And usually you exceed those 2 minutes.
That's cool. The 2 minute commitment. Yeah, I like that one. This is very good. Okay. I'm going to send you the video as well of this because hopefully you can share it with your people on your side of the world.
Okay.
And it's everybody's input helping writers. And so, hello to everybody in the Philippines watching this in the future, next week, next year. Those select people you decide want to watch it. And thank you for that, for sharing it. If you do, and it's up to you. You're not obliged to share it, but if you want to, you're allowed. We're not precious about knowledge. We think it should be shared. All knowledge should be free. So it should be loud free so that people get a chance. Everybody gets a chance to tell their story, whatever story is burning inside them. So that's very good. So I think we've covered two of the points. Is there anything else you want to add, Joan? Any other subject matter? Anything we've missed? Anything you'd like to add? I found that really, really interesting. I'm going to test that. You can email me in the future and test whether I've used this. Okay, question and three keywords. I have to keep it simple for myself, okay? A question, but it's a great way to start a question and some keywords, writing some keywords to move things on. So thank you for that really interesting thing. Tip, tactic, strategy. Is it a tactic or a strategy? I get confused.
Well, I just call it a trick.
A trick. Okay. Thank you,
Yeah.
Joe. Is there any, back to you, Joe.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think the most difficult writer's block really is the fear, the ego, and I think both Robin and I have um particular ways on how to approach it. From my end, I just think of two things. First, I remind myself that the written language is asynchronous, so I can allow my writing to be as bad as it has to be, so long as I complete my bullet points. Because I can always go back, criticize it like anything, and the moment I criticize my own work, usually the solutions also come in afterwards. So during the writing part, I don't worry about it. In fact, my what I realize is that we always talk about writer's block, but I haven't heard so much about editor's block. The editors seem to always know what to do.
Okay.
Um, yeah,
Good.
and then I think the other thing, to temper my own ego is to ask myself, am I writing to become rich and famous? Because if we want to just be rich and famous, we don't have to write, right? So, but if I have a story to tell, then I just should focus on the story, regardless whether the way I'm telling it right now is good or bad. And usually those reminders get me back on track. Yeah.
I think the pleasure of creating. We live in this world of consuming, and it's never enough. You can never get a big enough TV or enough something. Okay, there's always when you consume, you always want more. Okay, but when you create, the pride you get in creating things, even if no one sees it, the pride of creating is a wonderful thing, certainly for me, and I think it's pretty common, the pride creating that we have the abilities we're tapping into, and there's also the thing we're tapping into once we get into the zone, or what are we tapping into? Human creativity, the ability to think and to create worlds beyond our own, which who knows in the future they could all of our novels could be turned into movies or worlds in another reality. Everything we create could be recreated. Perhaps we're creating the world as we write it. Perhaps that's what we're doing, creating new worlds as we write them. Robin, what do you think about that? You're a fantasy writer. What do you think about that? Creating new worlds as we write them.
Well, um, yeah, definitely. So I was a fantasy writer. Now I'm a history fiction writer. And what do? At first I thought I was trying to be faithful to what's written there in history. And then I eventually realized, no, I'm creating my new history here. So yeah, creation of worlds, creation of time as well, I think. I'm not just creating worlds, spaces, I'm also creating time, apparently.
Well, I wrote a 3-book series about a Roman emperor, his life, and I read the biggest academic books about his life, okay? The most important academic books about his life. And there are pieces in the early chapters where there are no references and the historian makes it up, okay? You can see that the historian, because he says, we believe this happened, okay? And there's no reference, and the book is full at the end with lots of different footnotes. But for this particular period of his life, it is clearly made up, okay? That the historian has just made up these things. And this is the leading historian on this particular, who's quoted in all the papers about him. And that they're clearly making things up. And certainly you see when you go back, for instance, it's 150 years, that things were written from a very Christian perspective, or if you go back even further, different perspectives. And there are various different views about now they're coming to revisionist views about history and about who wrote the history, so that we don't know the history that you've been taught in school. If you trace it back, how much of that is actually true? We're not sure. We're starting to reach a stage of course, alternative truth. But it's interesting. What you create, the history, could be what is read in 20 or 50 years and assumed to be the truth. Okay.
Yeah.
So you could be creating the truth that people in 50 years, young students will read and might be, of course, historical novels are better than the truth because truth can be very boring. Historical novels wrap it up nicely with a bit of bow. Okay. Let's stop blabbering. Now, okay, anyone, any reactions? We're not going to go much longer, okay? Anyone want to add any final pieces to this puzzle?
I would just comment and say that I think it's fascinating to listen to Yam, I hope I have the pronunciation correct, and Robin on the how writing is created in the Philippines and how it's passive. That's fascinating to me, that culturally the differences are that stark. Because I would think we're certainly not passive in our writing, Lawrence, would I be correct? Um, so I think that's fascinating to see the difference in the literature culturally. I think this is a great opportunity.
Yes, I know there are definite differences, cultural differences, between Asian cultures and ours, but I don't know enough to
Mm,
really, I don't know enough to really comment about how deep they are. But it's certainly an interesting point about the passive characters. I think there are Irish stories. Some are, of course, there's a difference between literary and genre fiction.
yeah,
Well, genre fiction is very active, and literary fiction can often be passive, which is one of the reasons I don't read it very much. Okay,
you don't read which?
literary fiction.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, okay.
I like action. I don't know if that's a
Mm,
male thing because then you also have the male view, okay, as well. So you got
mm,
gender issues as well coming in there, okay.
mm,
And of course the type of things that you like. You've got genetic issues of that things that you enjoy. Maybe you people enjoy, and then there's the shadow stuff about what our subconscious wants, okay,
mm,
to read. So it's a multi-layered problem, and I'm probably only scratching the surface. But your point is well made. Thank you. Did you want to
mm.
add anything else?
No, other than I think it is, we can be very critical as writers of ourselves, and a number of times we've made critical comments throughout this call about various aspects of we're not doing this well, we're not doing that well. I think the fact that we're turning up to create, as you say, the importance of what we are doing for humanity. We are creating something, we are giving a voice to certain topics, whether it's genre or literary or whatever it is that we're writing about. We are adding such value, and I think we need to remind ourselves regularly of that we are not here for the ego and the money that's in writing. We all know that. I have to say, I probably didn't know it was as stark as it is until I got into it. So we are not doing it for a monetary reward. We need to be kinder to ourselves for what we are adding to humanity and adding to the literary landscape worldwide.
That's very good. Thank you, Anne Marie. That's very good. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you. Susan, did you want to add anything before we wrap up?
Um, I think just, I mean, obviously, to thank you for arranging this, and thank you both to Joam and to Robin for like a really very sort of inspiring views on writing, and particularly on the sort of practicalities of writer's block. I think two things just very quickly to pick up on in relation to kind of the passive or the active um, way of writing. I think another area that I find particularly interesting, which you get a good bit of in Irish literature, is satire as a response to a kind of inhibition in terms of the culture that you're writing within. So I don't know how strong a tradition there is of that within sort of Philippines writing. And the other thing, to pick up on what Anne Marie was saying, I think, um, without becoming political, as the world becomes more unstable, I think it is true that writers and writing and humanities in general is one of the ways in which we articulate a better vision of the future. It is the future world by responding to whatever you criticize about what's going on in any aspect of life. So one of the ways in which humans have always um, responded and articulated an actual vision of the future has been through writing, not always realism, but very often through fantasy. I think that's one of the reasons that Margaret Atwood does not describe her work as fantasy or science fiction, because everything that she is describing has or can happen. So I think that it is what we are doing, is significant. It isn't just us telling a story. I think it has an actual significance. So thanks very much.
That's very good, Susan. Really important. Thank you for that. And Anne-Marie bringing us into that. Very important. Lots of food for thought here. Thank you. So I'll go Robin next. Robin, any responses to any of this?
So yeah, going back to what we do as writers, I think for me, what really helped is I try to not take myself too seriously. Um, yeah. Like it's not a crime if I created something crappy. It's not a crime to myself. It's not a crime to the world. So yeah, I just let it be. It's I try to not take my writing seriously. I try to not take myself too seriously. Okay, I give my permission to create something laughable and funny. I mean, it will entertain people anyway. So yeah,
That's good.
if it is laughable.
Well, everything we do is a bit laughable, isn't it? Everything. It depends what side of the fence you're on. But we try and do it with grace. And I really appreciate you being on the call and your contribution. And thank you, Robin. Very, very interesting, everything. And finally, Joan, I hope I get that right. Go ahead with your response to all of this.
I found the discussion of the passive character and active character very fascinating because incidentally, I'm still exploring it up to now, but I have a suspicion that the tradition of stories in the West, the reason why it's active is because you could trace the roots of stories uh, trying to mimic history, while in the East, um, stories emerge from philosophizing, and that's why the characters are passive because they're absorbing, they're reflecting the world, and I realize that well, I mean, I think at the end of the day, what matters is that the reader has a good time, that they feel that their time is not wasted. If the passive character leads to an enlightenment, great. If the active character leads the reader to a sense of vicarious experience, that's also great. Yeah.
Is the philosophy, are you talking about Confucianism, the impact of Confucianism mainly?
Um, I am not yet quite sure. It might stem from Zen Buddhism because there is a particular pattern common in Japan, in Korea, and China. In Japan, it's called Vakisho Tenketsu. And it's usually known as the four-act structure, but when I dug a bit further, I discovered that this four-act structure is based on poetry, and that kind of poetry is used for philosophizing, and I found that really fascinating. In contrast to, if you look at the word story, trace back its etymology, you'll discover that the word story comes from the word history. And
Yes.
then that realized that, oh, so the stories in the West are most likely coming from I mean, it's trying to get its cues from how history is told. Whereas when it comes to the East, they're philosophizing.
So the Japanese poetic structure, what is the name for that again? The Japanese poetic structure?
Isho Tenketsu.
Ishotenkatsu. Very good. And that's a traditional Japanese style, and it has influenced others in the East with this.
Yes. In fact, I'm so surprised they use it in their anime, they use it in their movies. They even use it in the structure of their video games. I said, wow.
Wow. And tell me a little bit about it. So it follows a personal journey, an interior journey, a quest.
Well, generally the way it works is it's broken into four parts: ki, sho, ten, and ketsu. Ki is the introduction of the subject matter. Sho is a further exploration of the subject matter. The third part, which is the ten, sometimes it's translated as a twist or a turn, but if you look at the pattern in what they mean with a twist or turn, it's not the way it's not the way it's understood in the West, but usually there's a new subject matter, a seemingly unrelated subject matter that gets introduced in the third part, the third act. And then when you reach the Ketsu part, what has been introduced in the ki and the ten, they get synthesized, and then all of a sudden, everything makes sense. It's a very interesting structure, um, but it defies the three-act structure, the five-act structure, but it works.
That's really interesting. Thank you for explaining that. Very, very interesting. I think we are caught up in things like the Bible and the influence of the Bible and the stories in the Bible, which is probably one of our oldest books. And it applies to all the Western monotheistic religions, you know, the Bible, story, history. And you're absolutely right. We tell those stories in that particular way. That's really fascinating. Okay. That's really interesting. Okay. So, with that, leaving everyone, I hope, with things to think about in how we write our stories. And this is to everyone who's watching this later in the future, when we're all gone, okay, that people will be watching this because we'll put it, it'll be shared now and it'll go across everywhere, lots of places. We hope that the stories will continue on and this discovery of what are we writing? What are we really writing? And why are we writing? And why we cannot write sometimes has been really interesting. I've got some practical examples. I hope everybody's gained from this. And please get in touch again. I'd like to hear more from you. And thank you, everybody, for turning up today and being on this call. Thank you. I'm going to stop the recording now.